think we'll be interacting today to have an understanding about what is IBP, maybe a quick IBP overview session before we start getting into deep dives. Right? Please ping on chat if my voice is audible. Good. I think yes, most of us can hear me properly. Not sure how many of you have attended the previous session where we wanted to elaborate on the content of this training curriculum. Maybe if you are attending this session for the first time, you can say yes. So quite a big bunch of people who are attending the session for the first time. So we might revisit the topic or the discussions what we had during last session. So I apologize if it's becoming repetitive for those who have already attended those sessions, but it's a good opportunity to revise ourselves. Right? Again, if anybody has prior experience in supply chain planning, type Y. If you do not have experience, type N. And do not hesitate to share your feedback on this question so that I will understand at what level of depth I need to get into during the discussion, right? And which topics I need to be more precise, more elaborative, especially when I'm talking about certain acronyms from IBP perspective. Now I see there is a mixed batch here. So people who have experience or maybe a working experience from supply chain planning perspective, please help to elaborate in a short term if you have experience in, let's say, APO, or if you have experience in some APO demand planning or APO supply planning or any MRP like that. So that I understand till what depth you have experience in supply chain planning solutions or processes. You can type in a quick sentence there. Okay. Specifically, anybody has worked on SAP APO earlier? Okay, no problem. We can touch base on the APO part as well. Good question, Ravili. Yes, APO is not mandatory for IBP, but people who have experience in APO, probably they will be able to relate IBP configurations or planning processes faster than those who do not have APO experience. So do not worry. If you do not have APO experience, it doesn't matter. Okay. During the training session, we have designed this session in such a way that even a fresher should be able to understand what is IBP. He should be able to understand the configurations behind it. He should be able to configure the system as per the requirements and also deal with the clients, right? So although APO is an advantage, but it's not a mandatory thing. All right. So yes, Ravindra. So during the training sessions, I think Parminder would have already shared with you the details of training content. We have divided the content in multiple ways so that if somebody wants to avail the training only for the S&OP or demand planning, we have that package with us. Or if somebody wants to attend the full course, that package is also there, right? So please get in touch with the team here, Parminder's team, to understand the details of the package, the flexibility what we have, and so on. Okay, I'll quickly probably jump to again a background of planning, certain acronyms we will use, and then maybe a quick overview on IBP before we start getting into the configurations from next session onwards. Right? So this session will help you to understand what is IBP all about, what is supply chain planning all about, whether this training course will help you to get into specific roles, whether it can be a consulting role from the configuration perspective, from the IT service delivery perspective, or it can be an end user role as well, right? To perform the business functions within supply chain planning. So multiple, right now, probably the reason why you are attending this session is you would have heard about SAP IBP as one of the SAP cloud-based tool used.
Don't forget to subscribe our channel and click on bell icon to update yourself with latest SAP videos.
Used by most of the major clients for supply chain planning, right? And then you might have a doubt in mind that how it will help me in my career growth. So we will touch base those points as well. So I see Bhupinder has already provided the link for the details of this training curriculum. You can go through that offline and then get in touch with the team here so that we can initiate the discussion and then enroll you for the training. The training will be mixed. We will go through all the, probably what we can say is, we will first understand how IBP works, what are the configuration needs behind it. If from the implementation perspective, what are the standard use cases so that we can try to implement that use case. We will configure the system in that way. And there will be a lot of demonstrations, especially in system when we talk about S&OP, sales and operations planning, or demand planning processes. As well as we will also have conceptual understanding sessions on how roles and authorizations can be built in IBP, right? That is taken care by the IBP consultant itself. How supply planning works in IBP at a concept level. What are different ways of supply planning available as a part of standard out-of-box functionality provided by SAP, right? So all those details we'll be able to cover during multiple sessions for this curriculum. Yeah. By the time I would be talking, I might be also going through some messages what you are typing here. So IBP module usage in SCM function, right? So when Manish, when you say SCM, it becomes a huge, big box, supply chain management. You can also call it as one of the process within supply chain planning, right? Now SAP has built this box as SCM, wherein in earlier days, APO was part of it. Now, considering the need of cloud-based tool, SAP came up with a new concept altogether, which is to enable the planners to use the functionalities in a faster way with a better user experience via cloud-based tool, which is called SAP IBP, right? So it is not part of SCM box altogether, but yes, it is part of the SCM or supply chain planning processes, the system which supports the supply chain planning process, right? So that way it is linked. What are different modules within IBP? That could be also one of the common questions you may have. So we will go through those modules. Not necessarily you should have expertise in all modules. You can focus on any of the module based on your experience, and then mature your understanding in other modules also, right? So we don't need to rush into a mode that I need to learn everything from IBP perspective. It's a time-taking process. You should have a starting point. Consider one module as a starting point, understand that very well, and then slowly you should understand the integrations between other modules, and then the nitty-gritties of those modules. Is part of SCM process? To become SCM consultant, what module knowledge one should have, right? Is nothing but materials management. Definitely, it's part of SCM process. What module knowledge one should have? I would say what process knowledge one should have is, we should understand when I talk about supply chain planning process, what does it cover? What are different sub processes within it? When I say I'm a demand planner, or I carry a function of demand planning, what is that function of demand planning that we should understand? and then how that function can be managed by a software that we will try to learn, right? How that function can be configured using SAP IBP, that we can learn. What different other processes? I will go through that process separately now, once I touch base on planning, and then you will be able to understand more. And then let's see if you still have further question. Rajesh asking, so IBP is not part of SCM box like EWM TM? That's correct. IBP is altogether a separate system, right? It is web-based UI or Excel-based UI. So the way you would have already experienced EWM or TM in earlier in-premises system, this is totally different, right? So most of the time you will see we will be using Excel. That means Excel is a front end, but in the back end, it is SAP provided system, which is called as IBP. What is IBP? It is integrated business planning, right? The system name is integrated business planning. I think we have touched base on a lot of questions. So let us go through the simple elaboration of what is supply chain planning all about, right? And then we will talk about different processes within it. Just stop sharing for a moment. Yes, that's right. It is a cloud-based product. Let me share again. Let me try to think about a common scenario of a manufacturing organization, right? So let's take a simple example. You have a manufacturing plant. You produce finished goods within this manufacturing plant. I take a simple example. To produce this finished good, you consume raw material. I can say raw material 1, raw material 2, okay? And maybe a packaging material 1 as an example. Okay? This raw material 1 is sourced from vendor 1. Raw material 2 is sourced from vendor 2. And maybe packaging material sourced from vendor 3. So you have 3 suppliers, dedicated suppliers in this case, to supply raw material 1 to manufacturing plant, raw material 2 to manufacturing plant, and raw material packaging material to manufacturing plant, right? A normal procurement process, right? Then once you produce this finished good, what you do is you transfer this finished good to a central warehouse. Right? This is normally typical scenario within an organization, right? So I'm not complicating the scenarios at the starting, keeping it simple so that everybody understands it. From this central warehouse, you can ship this finished good to multiple regional distribution centers. So I call it as RDC. So maybe it is RDC 1, RDC 2, RDC 3, and RDC 4 as an example. Okay? So if you take an example of India, you have different regional distribution centers to cover eastern part, west part, south part, and north part, right? That means there are dedicated customers, for example, customer C1 or customer C2, who are in the eastern part of the country and are always delivered the goods from a dedicated regional distribution center situated in eastern part of the country. Similarly, there are C3 and C4 customers who gets the goods from RDC2, which is on the western part of the country. C5 and C6 are the customers located in northern side, are serviced from the warehouse or regional distribution center at the northern part of the country. And then there are C7 and C8 customers, right, who are located in south and serviced from the southern regional distribution center, right? So normally you will see this is a kind of network from supply chain perspective, right? So starting point is either customer comes up with an order, which could be sales order, or within your organization, you have a business function to predict the future orders or to predict the future demand, which is nothing but a forecast. Right? Who does this function? Sales order comes via your customer service department. Forecasting is done by your demand planning department, right? Or it's a collaborative process. Now, if the forecast is generated to be shipped from those specific regional distribution centers, right? Then what next? We need to understand the replenishment planning as well, right? Meaning that if I have a forecast on these regional distribution centers, based on the stocks available in those regional distribution centers, how much is the shortage, right? That is called as net requirement calculation, right? And if there is a shortage, from where I should source the goods. So in this scenario, I'm going to source the goods from central warehouse. So this is nothing but your net requirement calculation. People who have experience in SAP, they will understand this as stock transport requisitions, right? Between two locations, receiving location as RDCs and supplying location as central warehouses, right? It's a planning element. Stock transfer equation is a planning element, right? Requisition indicates it is still at a requisition level, not at an execution order level. It is not a purchase order as such, right? Or stock transport order as such, which is an execution element. What system would check or what process would check here again is if the central warehouse is receiving the demands from all these 4 regional distribution centers, it will again do the netting with the stocks available at central warehouse and identify the net requirement and again pass this net requirement to the source location, which is manufacturing plant, right? So in manufacturing plant, there will be a net requirement or shortage calculation happening for finished good, and system will generate, if there is a shortage, system will generate a production signal, which is called as planned order, right? Which can be discussed by the manufacturing production planner and decide if I have raw materials available, if I have machine capacities available to produce these goods, and then along with the manufacturing team, they will confirm the order to be executed as either production order.
Don't forget to subscribe our channel and click on bell icon to update yourself with latest SAP videos.
Or process order based on the industry, right? Whether you are in a discrete manufacturing, you will call it as a production order, or if you are in the process industry, you will call it as a process order, right? It's an execution signal to the manufacturing team, right? And now based on the planned order, which is a production signal for finished good, system will also calculate the dependent requirement for components and generate purchase requisitions. These purchase requisitions will be discussed with vendor to understand their capacities, to finalize the schedules, and then it can be converted into purchase orders, right? So this is a common scenario. You would be understanding that yes, from where did we start? Either getting the signal demand from sales order perspective or from the forecast perspective. So you have a demand planning function. This entire box to calculate the net requirements from regional distribution centers to warehouses to manufacturing plant would be taken care by a person called as supply planner, right? So you heard different roles called as demand planner, performing a specific business function. You also heard a term called as supply planner, right? You also heard a term called as production planner, right? At times they are also termed as asset planners because he's managing those machines, he's managing those capacities, and then aligning the production plan with the manufacturing team. And then you also heard a process where we are generating the requirements for components and then dealing with vendors or suppliers to understand or to finalize the procurement schedule. So there can be a role called as material planner. There might be some common roles used by within industry, but in general, you will hear these terms or these people performing these kind of functions. Okay? I just take a pause here to see if there are any questions. Uh, I see one question coming up from Anand. So do we have to switch off ATP from S4 when we use IBP? No. ATP is altogether a dedicated functionality. What is ATP? Available to promise, right? For people who probably are hearing this ATP term for the first time. So we will touch base what is ATP all about and how it is different. Basically, Anand, when you are talking about ATP from sales order perspective, that is more from the execution angle perspective, right? Where actually sales order comes in, system tries to check based on certain rules whether there is a sufficient amount of stock available so that system can confirm the sales order requirement delivery date and fulfill that demand, right? So available to promise is still configured in ECC or in S4, right? From sales order execution perspective, right? Good question, Vijay. What is the difference between supply planner and materials planner? Eventually, in an organization, you may hear maybe both functions are done by the same supply planner or same person, right? But in general, what can be the differentiation is supply planner is more focusing on understanding the requirements coming as part of uh, forecast net requirement calculation from the regional warehouses till the central warehouses till the manufacturing plant for finished goods. Whereas material requirement or material planners would be focusing more on the demand signal coming out of this finished good plan, getting the dependent demands for the components, and understanding the replenishment proposals, which are purchase requisitions for components. So in certain organizations, material planner is more focusing on components demand generated because of finished goods demand, right? And then understanding how these purchase requisitions can be dealt with supplier. Whereas supply planner is more focusing on understanding how the demand is getting derived uh, from my shipping warehouse till my central warehouse till my manufacturing plant, specifically for finished good, right? But in certain organizations, there is a dedicated person who would be dealing with the finished goods planning as well as components planning, and that's why you may hear a common term. But in general, you can have different people working for finished goods planning as a supply planning role and components planning for materials planning role. There is one more point. All this planning is linked to execution. Which module of SAP is required to learn? Good question. So I talked about planning processes and the different roles and functions people would be doing. So let us also try to understand its integration from execution perspective, right? So let's say if your organization is a demand generation organization, which you normally predict the forecast. So once you predict the forecast, once you calculate the net requirements, once you understand the possible production signals, once you understand the possible purchase signals, and then start working from the execution perspective, then your customer representative may bring a actual execution order, which is a sales order. So this is an execution element, right? Now, if I talk about sales order as an execution element, where does it get created first? It gets created in ECC or S4, which is your execution system, right? Under sales and distribution function. Right. So that means you would have ECC or S4 configured, and there will be a sales and distribution module, dedicated module used for that sales order execution part. There are a lot of sub processes within sales order management. So if you would go through the basic training of sales and distribution within S4, you will understand those sub processes. We also have another execution element. So once planning is done, now let us say you have understood that this much amount of finished good needs to be produced. So you will first check with the capacities of machine, labor capacities, component availability, etc. Discuss the plan with your execution team. And then once you are aligned, you will finally align a production plan for, let's say, next 3 weeks or next 4 weeks in terms of converting that planned order into production order or process order. Again, another execution element within ECC or S4 under production execution. So there is a different module altogether. You can call it as production planning module or production execution module within ECC and S4 to execute that production activity. So there will be different sub processes within execution to make sure that the production is executed correctly, components are issued against those orders, consumed against those orders to manufacture the assemblies or finished goods. Right? Once the goods are available in manufacturing plant, what next? You need to ship that goods to receiving location. So in this example, it is a common central warehouse which will receive the goods. Right? So in this example, let's say you do not have a storage capacity in manufacturing plant. So what you do is, the moment you manufacture it, you load the goods into trucks and ship it to the central warehouse, right? Which is called as, from the element perspective, it is called as stock transport order, right? Converting that stock transport requisition into execution element, which is stock transport order. Who does this activity? There is a logistics activity, right? Which is again in ECC or S4. Okay, under logistics, some people will call it supply distribution. Right? So there will be a lot of warehouse management functionalities you would hear when you go through the trainings of logistics within ECC or S4. Right? Then once the goods are again available at central warehouses, those goods needs to be again distributed based on the demand proportions to respective regional distribution centers. Right? Again, it would be covered by logistics. And there, in between, there can be additional processes like quality management to check the quality of the finished goods produced or receive the quality of raw materials which are sourced. Right? So just to add on the planning specific roles, you will also hear a role called as distribution planner. Supply planner is working in the backward direction to understand the demand coming from regional distribution centers to warehouse to finished goods manufacturing plant, right? Whereas distribution planner is more focusing in the forward direction. Once he understands how many goods are going to be produced as my part of production order, how many pallets it is going to cover so that I can arrange for the truck, I can arrange for the logistics, and then how can I ship the goods from manufacturing plant to central warehouse, or from central warehouse, how do I use the distribution percentage to distribute that amount of good to regional distribution centers and keep the remaining stock in my central warehouse, right? So that part would be also covered by a distribution planner. Okay, I take a pause and see if there are any questions in that area. Right. So a valid question Vijay, what is PPDS and how it's different from IBP? Good question, right? I'll cover that. So now what we did, we talked about different business functions, how a typical manufacturing organization can have a high level picture of supply chain planning, right? What are different roles that supply chain planning processes can cover? What are different execution elements? Those are part of the planning results, and how planning is integrated with my ECC or S4, so that once planning is done, when the actual order executions happens, these elements needs to be executed and linked to my ECC or S4. Right? Now, in older days, when we talk about now, as you already mentioned that you have some experience in MRP, right? MRP is nothing but net requirement calculation tool, a simple net requirement calculation tool without looking at any constraints within your supply chain, right? So similarly, supply planning or SNP, supply network planning, also has those features. So if we look at the olden days, maybe it was only ECC or R3 which had these MRP functionalities, a normal, simple tool to calculate your net requirements, right? Then SAP came up with a new system called as SAP APO, Advanced Planning and Optimization, right? Where they said, fine, from supply chain planning perspective, there are different functions performed by different people. So we will provide you those modules. So in order to carry out demand planning function, we will provide you a module called as APO SAP Demand Planning. Okay. SAP APO Demand Planning. Okay. So in short term, it is called as DP. Right. So there could be a functionalities required to be configured in APO demand planning to understand how I can predict the demand. Right. Then SAP also said, okay, fine. You want to calculate net requirements? We will provide you an module called as Supply Network Planning. Okay. In short, it is called as SNP. Then, once you identify the net requirements, you need to finalize your short-term detailed production plan, right? Which is called as production planning and detailed scheduling, which is called as PPDS. Right. Materials requirement planning. Normally, this can be also kept in ECC system under your MRP. And distribution planning is called as, again, distribution planning called as DRP, distribution requirement plan. So that based on your production signals, you finalize your distribution plan, and APO can also help you to create those stock transport orders, right? Which via using transport load builder functionality. So these are different mechanisms SAP provided in SAP APO tool to help supply chain planning users to carry out these functions. I just take a pause and see if any question. I see some noise around. Okay, it might be by mistake. So I go back to the question. So Vijay, so what is PPDS and how it's different from IBP, right? Now you understand in older days, your short-term production planning and scheduling, you needed a tool, right? So SAP came up with a module called as SAP APO PPDS, where you can focus on your short-term production planning in minutes, in hours, in days also, right? Because you need to have a detailed schedule for your next 3 weeks or next 4 weeks. Whereas when you are planning for your midterm or long-term horizon, you don't need to have a detailed schedule. That can be taken care by supply network plan, right? So if you look at the horizon perspective, supply network planning focus is more from midterm, like let's say from 1 month onwards till next 24 months, as an example. Whereas production planning will focus only on today till next 30 days, right? So there is a bifurcation of production planning and supply network planning, right? Short term is production planning, and then the midterm to long term is supply network planning, right? I take a pause and see if you have any questions in mind about topics what we discussed. I'm not getting into system so far, right? You haven't heard much about IBP. I'm still trying to focus more on the functions and the concepts of planning, right? And then later point of time in the subsequent sessions, we will start going into deep dive of IBP details, right? Any questions so far? Okay. Okay. So SAP strategy was to make sure clients will start using SAP APO for their planning processes, right? And focus on execution in R3 or ECC. That's how SAP APO started becoming popular, right? And then maybe not all the models were being used. So few clients wanted to use SAP only from the demand planning function perspective. So they were using SAP APO demand planning, and they continued with MRP. Then later point of time, people also started using APO supply planning along with demand planning, and then carrying out their demand planning process for finished good as well as net requirement calculations process for finished goods in APO, and then using MRP for components, and then for the further execution, right? Then slowly people started using DRP functionalities to calculate the distribution requirements and create the distribution plan, right? And then slowly they evolved with a full-fledged functionality of production planning and detailed scheduling as well as transport load builder, right? So if you are working with any organization, maybe from client perspective or from service delivery perspective, you would have heard these terms. How now we understand how these modules or sub modules being used, right? And for what purpose. Okay. Okay, I'll go through some of the questions again. So what is advanced planning? Does it cover PPDS? Yes. Abhishek, if your question is on advanced planning part from S4 perspective, yes, I will cover that part now during the discussion. Next question, what roles one can opt for after learning IBP? Good question. And please elaborate supply network planning again. Let's go through that again, right? So first question, probably I'll take up that advanced planning part. I just take a pause on those three and then see, and in the logical discussion, those would be covered again here. So once SAP APO started becoming popular, clients started using it independently for demand planning process, for supply planning process, or integratedly for all the submodules, right? However, there was a feedback coming from organizations that we are good to have these individual processes using SAP APO, but one key element of supply chain planning is also a process called as sales and operations planning.
Don't forget to subscribe our channel and click on bell icon to update yourself with latest SAP videos.
Right? It is more of an integrated widened process which covers a lot of subtopics of demand planning, supply demand planning in the sense demand generation, demand review, supply plan generation, supply review, and then work collaboratively with different departments to finalize your plan, to understand the constraints, to adapt to those constraints, and finalize on your constraint demand, work with your leadership, your high-level stakeholders to define those KPIs, review those KPIs or metrics, right? Within your with your supply chain directors, with your finance directors to align on their financial strategy, etc. Right? So that collaborative communication mechanism was called as sales and operations planning, which was not at all covering with by SAP APO as a common platform, right? We had individual tools or individual modules within APO, but sales and operations planning was never covered. And with this feedback, then SAP came back to those organizations and asked them, if you don't find the tool now, what do you do? They said, we use this process using Microsoft Excel. Right? So there is an offline mechanism. We download the demands from APO demand planning, put it into Excel, review the supply plan into Excel, have the Excel as a tool, work with Excel as a tool while collaborating with different stakeholders, and then finalize the consensus demands or aligning the constraint demands, etc. Right? So with this feedback, SAP thought that why not try to create a module which will help the organization to carry out their sales and operations plan. Right? Then a thought came up was, let us build a tool to do this functionality, but just to keep the user experience intact, as users are more familiar with Excel, can we think about utilizing Excel as a front end, whereas providing a tool in the backend which will help them to perform S&OP. And that's how evolvement of IBP came up. Right? Initially, probably they thought of a name called as S&OP, and then the name got matured as integrated business planning. And this is how IBP got evolved. Right? Now, I will go through the different models of IBP, and then we will understand how advanced planning is dealt with. Right? So I'll take that question when we discuss about different models within IBP. Right? I think I'll go through some of the other questions also. Okay, so what roles one can opt for after learning IBP? So good question, Manish, again here. Roles, what you can opt for is, you have multiple options. One is, you can be part of the IT industry, right? Where you can play a role of configuration expert. Based on your earlier experience, different roles can be derived, right? You can also play a role of supply chain planning IT lead. Some people are more expert in understanding the processes, discussions with clients, understanding their requirements, and passing the requirements to the execution IT team. So you can also play those roles of kind of process leads. Right? From IT perspective, there can be different multiple roles which are available during the project phases. Right? You can also have a dedicated role for config expert. We already mentioned you can have a dedicated role for testing expert, right? So that you can also you are able to validate the processes which are configured by your configuration team and test those, right? And then deploy it before it goes to production. And then you can also have a wider role from the supply chain leadership perspective within IT. Then there can be end user specific roles, right? Which we discussed. You can be a demand planner, supply planner, production planner, materials planner. These are all actual roles used by the users within that organization. Or you can also have some intermediate roles. Like you can be a bridge between IT and end users. So there are a lot of roles which we, in modern term, we call it as business process consultant, business process analyst, functional analyst, right? Who try to get the requirements from the end users, be part of the uh, project teams during implementation from business side, representing the business side, and collaborating with the IT service delivery team, implementation team, to make sure that the IT team understands the requirement, and then this team becomes the face for the business and IT, right? So there are a lot of roles available from supply chain planning perspective, uh, where your IBP experience will help, right? Because in any industry, when you're going for IBP implementation, or when you have implemented IBP and want to continue the steady state, you you need to perform these rules, right? So definitely, uh, anyone having the IBP exposure can try to fit himself within these roles based on his other soft skills, right? Apart from the technical knowledge, right? So that's the explanation what I would have for roles one can opt for, right? Please elaborate supply network planning. Vijay, I'll take a pause on this question. We will have detailed discussion on supply planning in further sessions. Basically, in short, what we are saying is supply network planning is nothing but, from finished goods perspective, understand where the demand comes from. If I have a demand in that specific location, based on the stock availability, how much is the shortage, right? If I have a demand of 100, and in that regional distribution center, if I have a stock of 10 pieces, then my shortage is 90 pieces. If I need to replenish this 90 pieces shortage, what is the primary source? Primary source in this example was warehouse, so that I should be able to transfer the demand to warehouse, calculate the total aggregated demand at warehouse, and then pass the shortage again back to the manufacturing plant, and then work collaboratively with my production planning team to help them understand that these are the requirements coming up because of the forecast, and let us plan in advance for horizon of, let's say, 1 month onwards to 24 months, so that you can have a visibility of the demands for next 2 years. You can have a visibility of production requirements for next 2 years, and accordingly, system can generate the requirements for components, so that material planner can decide and align with the supplier to decide the schedules of those raw materials, right? Because raw materials might have a longer lead time. So it is necessary to give a good amount of visibility to suppliers for the demands of those raw materials coming out of demands from the finished goods, right? So that's the purpose of supply network planning. How do we do that? What are the different ways of carrying out supply network planning? We will take it up during the further discussions, further sessions. Next question, was APO part of ECC and went to SCM? No. One of the planning functionality did exist in ECC, like MRP, but when SAP started thinking about a separate module altogether, they named it as a SAP APO, as a separate module, where you will have all these sub modules of demand planning, supply planning, production planning would be fit into one common platform, right? High level, they call it as SCM. Within SCM, APO is one of the submodule. You may also have EWM part of the SCM, right? Or TM part of the SCM, etc. Right. Uh, right. So I see one more question. Let me just quickly check. Vijay asking how to plan tier 1 vendor demand to tier 2 vendor, tier 3 plan. So this is all about your planning flow, Vijay, right? And then you need to decide from primary planning perspective, what level of complexity you want to keep in system, and what level of exceptions you want to handle manually, right? You may have multi-sourcing scenarios where multiple vendors exist, but when there is a shortage of raw material, what is your primary supplier, so that a purchase equation can get generated based on primary supplier. Or if there are multiple vendors, in what proportions of demand you want to transfer the demands to multiple vendors, which in ECC term, you would have heard a term called as quota, right? So based on what quota you want to pass this demand to multiple vendors and so on, right? From the flow perspective, probably we will elaborate that flow in detailed sessions once we'll start configuring the supply chain network and understand how the supply planning would work in this case. Right?
Just one question. So
Right.
here we know one component I'm getting from two vendors. That understood from the quota perspective.
Correct.
Again, the vendor to manufacture that component given to my manufacturing plant, my production plant, he needs further raw materials. So he has to again send that demand to his supplier.
Right.
Supplier. Let us say raw material. Let us say he's manufacturing petrol tank for me. He need a steel. So what we are doing, we are planning aggregating all the demand of the steel from multiple, let us say, metallic part suppliers. So we want to control that as well. So is there any possibility or feature in SAP, so which will take care of supplier planning?
Yes. Valid scenario, Vijay. The thing is, normally an organization will not try to model the constraints of the supplier, right? Because supplier is replenishing the raw materials like steel, as you mentioned, from another supplier, right? Or maybe a different vendor altogether. Now, it is part of that vendor's scope to manage this requirement planning at his level. So he may have his own ERP system where he would be dealing with the raw material planning for his suppliers. But you can still configure that, right? Let's say there are critical components where you want to have a visibility of suppliers limitations also. So at times people configure these vendors as another manufacturing plant, or even under the same plant they configure this as a sub production planning process, so that you can manage the capacity of that vendor using a resource capacity planning tool, right? But there are complications, because it is not your organization's responsibility to manage these specific schedules, right? It is the vendor's responsibility. So you need to align first that who is going to review these plans in your SAP system. Is it vendor who should have access, and he will check the capacity planning, capacity leveling of his own suppliers, or your material planner is going to take up that role, because it's an additional role for your material planner. Probably he does not have awareness of the vendor's suppliers constraint, right? So all those parameters are discussed initially, but yes, if at all there is a need, you can configure that scenario as you mentioned, tier 1 vendor, tier 2 vendor, etc., using a production planning process and updating the capacity of the supplier as a machine resource capacity, right? And then all labor resource capacity, and accordingly you will have visibility in your system. But again, it's a complex scenario. You need to align with your users who is going to perform that role, and whether they have visibility of those vendors supply constraints or not.
So if that is the case, can we map this in a standard SAP PP module, or
Yes, you can also map that in standard PP module, or even in SAP APO module, or even in SAP IBP module. The only thing is who is going to review that planning results, who is going to take actions on those. That's a part we need to be aware. But yes,
in our case, the people are interested to cover that part as well, to avoid the disruptions in the supply chain. So to have more resilient supply chain in case of this pandemic situations, how we can control. So, so the possibilities are there in FPP as well, right?
Right. That's possible. Yeah, possibilities are there. Right. Yeah.
It is in the capacity, vendor capacity.
Correct. Exactly. It is under vendor capacity calculations, and then you have to align as a process that this vendor capacity calculation will be monitored by whom? Am I going to provide access to vendors so that vendor manages this tool using our SAP system, or our planners will take up that responsibility? That's a bigger topic of the change management or the roles responsibility, what an organization has to decide. But yes, you can configure the solutions accordingly.
So in this case, the demand from the production unit is going to this specific vendor cost center or some sub cells in the or some other plant. So my basic manufacturing plant demand goes to these sub plants or
exactly. Yes, you can configure that accordingly with multiple plants representing multiple vendors, etc.
Okay. Thank you.
I go to the next question. Do we need to forecasting techniques like time series, etc., to learn IBP? It is good to learn those time series functionalities, Abhishek. When we will go through the demand planning detailed discussions, we will go through those time series functionalities, what features are available. Not necessarily you will have all the expertise of statistics, right, to understand or to carry out the demand planning nitty-gritties, but we will go through those basic concepts of for statistical forecasting, time series analysis, and then mature our understanding, right? So people who do not know what is time series analysis, etc., do not worry. When we will go through the demand planning specific techniques, we will understand those, right? And then we'll be able to also discuss with the demand planning teams during the implementations. Right, I think we covered that IBP is not part of the SCM box. That's we already covered. I think that's all. Okay, no questions so far. So what we talked about is how IBP started evolving, right? How APO was matured, and then SAP came up with the fantastic idea of providing the sales and operations planning functionality also using a common tool. Now, when we say sales and operations planning, it has all those sub-modules also, right? So what SAP thought was, if that is the case, can I design my IBP system in such a way that clients will start using sales and operations planning and also individual modules of SAP APO, so that I can get rid of SAP APO altogether and keep a common platform of IBP. And that's how IBP different modules started getting into introduction. Right. One more question coming up. How well IBP is integrated with other modules? Can we also integrate execution phase in IBP, or planning can be done here only? So, Ashish, IBP is more from planning perspective, like APO was there, but APO was well integrated with your ECC system, right? So there was an standard integration provided by SAP to transfer the planning results like purchase requisitions, planned orders, stock transfer requisitions, etc., from APO to your ECC via a standard integration called as core interface. Right? So you would have heard this term called as SIF. It was quite popular, it was quite mature over the period, and you would not have heard about multiple issues with data inconsistency between APO and ECC. SAP had also provided a reconciliation transaction so that if there are discrepancies, we can take action on it and synchronize the data. Right? Similarly, IBP can be also integrated with other modules of ECC. There is a mechanism provided by SAP on that. So when we go to the data integration training sessions, we will have an understanding of how IBP is integrated, right? I will try to touch base on high level topic for this once we go through the IBP modules, right? And that's how SAP started thinking about how they can make IBP as a common platform so that all these individual functions can also be covered within IBP, right? And then I see started from 2016, SAP started focusing more on sales and operations planning and demand planning to mature the solution. And now, as you would have heard, that SAP is going to completely decommission SAP APO so that they are asking clients to move to some other tools, and proposal from them would be obviously SAP IBP, right? So APO is going to be decommissioned from 2027. I think the hard stop is 2023. There is still some extension support that can be provided by 2027 to 2023. Let's see how SAP finalize that plan, right? But at the moment, the stand coming from SAP is they are going to completely obsolete SAP APO and in process of transitioning all the APO modules to IBP, right? While doing that, what they are saying is one of the module of production planning, which is called as PPDS, we will not transition that to IBP. We will transition that to S4 as ePPDS. I think there was a question from Anand, right? So, which is called as advanced planning. So for advanced planning, for short-term production plan and detailed schedule, SAP's strategy is they already have transitioned this APO PPDS module into S4 ePPDS module, right? And IBP is not the one which is going to be used for PPDS or short-term production planning perspective. For IBP, you can use demand planning, you can use supply planning, you can also calculate your net requirements, you can also calculate your allocations, but the lower level, short-term level production planning needs to happen in S4. That's how SAP as a strategic movement, they are putting those modules into those individual systems, right?
Don't forget to subscribe our channel and click on bell icon to update yourself with latest SAP videos.
Now, if I quickly show you one of the slide, probably we'll use it for understanding different modules. People who were part of the last session, it's a revision for you, but for those people who are understanding the IBP modules for the first time, let's focus on this slide. Okay. So at the bottom part, you see SAP HANA, which is again SAP HANA database, where the data would be used and stored from cloud storage perspective. Next bottom part, you see three individual modules: demand, IBP for demand, which will be used for calculating your demand generation, right? It can have functionalities of calculating the statistical forecasting, coming to the consensus forecast or constraint forecast calculations, and demand sensing functionalities. So if you want to do a detailed level of demand planning function, then SAP recommends to use IBP for demand module. Okay. Then part of your supply network planning, there are two sub-processes. One is you would also be interested to know how much of the safety stock you should have in your specific locations, right? To cater for any ad hoc demands coming in. Otherwise, you may, if you do not plan for the safety stocks, you may lose those ad hoc orders coming in from your customer service departments, right? So that you would plan to have some excess inventory, buffer inventory, I can say, to deal with those ad hoc demands. That safety stock planning is termed as inventory optimization. So there is a module available within IBP dedicatedly to perform the inventory optimization, right? And then you would have heard certain terms called as the algorithms like multi-stage inventory optimization techniques, which in earlier days, this statistics expert used to create those algorithms and provide those to calculate your safety stocks, right? And then over the period, SAP also came up with a advanced technique of calculating these buffer stocks by calling it as a demand-driven MRP, DDMRP. It's a quite recent process altogether, and then SAP thought of creating a solution for that. right? So there is a dedicated DDMRP organization who has come up with this process, right? And a solution behind it. That is also available as part of inventory optimization. That means to help you calculate your safety stocks, right? As part of the inventory optimization. And then calculate your supply plan using response and supply module altogether. So there is a module available to calculate your net requirements, calculate your unconstrained and constrained supply plan. Now, recent times, SAP is also focusing more on providing the distribution functionalities so that you can also calculate your distribution plan using response and supply, etc., or allocation planning, etc. Right? So part of those APO functionalities are moving into response and supply planning module. Right? So if you understand correctly, if you want to do only demand planning, use SAP for IBP. If you want to use supply planning and also calculate your safety stocks, you can use inventory optimization and response and supply. Right? Now, overall, in addition to these individual processes, you want to also have your sales and operations planning covering the wider picture, right? Understanding the strategic and tactical decision processes in mid-term to long-term horizon. You need a dedicated module called as sales and operations planning. Now we discussed that even while doing this collaborative discussion, there are a lot of high-level stakeholders which are involved, like your supply chain directors, marketing directors, your financial directors, and then they should have a visibility of your metrics, your performance within planning. So you can also configure a different module called as supply chain control tower, where you can use these functionalities for understanding the exceptions like alerts, right? To have more smoother collaboration, right? To get more information about your KPIs. Then you can configure those KPIs. You can utilize the control tower module, which can be used during your S&OP meetings, right? To understand that if I have a shortage situation, if my sales order quantity is greater than my forecast, in which location I see a excess safety stock, in which location I see a demand getting below my threshold, and so on, right? So that you can take necessary actions and align on those actions during your S&OP meetings, right? So we will discuss what is S&OP meeting, what is the cadence or schedule for those in normal organizations, etc., from process perspective. But in order to provide support to that process, how you can configure that process into system is nothing but an IBP S&OP module, right? Now, what SAP said that it is not mandatory for you to buy all these individual licenses. Based on your requirement, you can opt whether you want to use only S&OP. You can opt a license for S&OP. You can, if you want to use S&OP as well as demand planning, you can do that, and so on. So that's why it is not mandatory for the client to buy all the modules all together if you are not going to use it. So that's a flexibility also is available when you are getting the licenses for individual modules. I'm just trying to check for any questions. I think Manish had to leave. That's fine. Okay. So these are individual modules what we will have. Now in your training curriculum, right, when we'll get into details, our focus is to make sure we understand and be able to work sales and operations planning and demand planning, right? So we will focus more on these two modules to understand the configurations, to understand how I can set up my IBP system to carry out S&OP or demand planning, right? And at the same time, we will have a lot of demonstrations on that two modules, and then we will have a conceptual discussions on how response and supply planning is used, how time series supply planning is used, right? Where you will be able to understand how exactly I am able to relate my demand as an input and calculate my shortage requirements and pass these requirements to my manufacturing plant, right? So that you will have complete understanding of end-to-end process of demand as well as supply, right? And then we will also talk about how I can configure my customer alerts, how I can have a visibility of different charts so that I can use those charts, I can use those dashboards during my meetings with different stakeholders. And instead of creating those algorithms, those charts, dashboards in Excel, how I can leverage the IBP functionalities. Right. So as Bhupendra mentioned, if anyone wants to join the next session, you'll need to first enroll to the link what he has shared, right? And you will see different options provided there so that it will help you to understand that which session you should enroll or which training curriculum you should enroll. There was a question for us, which individual modules under IBP are mostly used by clients currently? Valid question. Sales and operations planning and demand are the most widely used. But there are clients here who are also using supply planning from IBP perspective, who have got rid of APO already and moved to response and supply and inventory optimization so that safety stock calculation, supply planning is also happening in IBP. However, SAP is putting a lot of efforts now to mature these individual modules from inventory and response and supply perspective so that there are no sub processes which are left over, which were already there in APO, but were not performing as accurately in IBP. So that's the key focus now. In last 5 years, I've seen SAP focusing more on S&OP and demand. Those modules are quite mature. A lot of people are liking it. They are in use by most of the clients. But now for SAP, the priority is on inventory and supply and response. So they're trying to optimize that, coming up with new features and making it more user friendly. Now, just to give you an idea, I spoke about IBP navigation. So as you have probably previously worked on SAP tools, so you know that there is a SAP GUI where you can log into different system, whether it is SAP APO, whether it is SAP ECC, right? And within SAP, there are transaction codes so that you can go to a specific function. If you want to display a material master, you have a transaction code for that. If you want to display a customer master, you have a transaction code for that. If you want to create a purchase order, you have a transaction. If you want to display a purchase order or change a purchase order, you have a different. So for each function, there is a transaction code linked to it, right? IBP, you will be able to use it in 2 ways, via web user interface, right? That means there is a dedicated URL provided, right? And using that URL, you will log in to the system and use web-based Fury apps. Okay? So you will use Fury apps to carry out specific function. Okay, we will get into details of these Fury apps once we start into the curriculum of planning area architecture and demand planning and so on. Right? So we will talk about those. Second one is, as we discussed earlier, you will also log into IBP via Excel UI. This is the most popular way of logging into IBP, right? And use the Excel front end to review your plan, to review your demand, to update your demand, to calculate the supply plan results, to review the supply plan results, to review the alerts, etc. Right? So planners would be using the Excel UI as a front end. Now, if you look at my Excel ribbon, you see a icon called as SAP IBP. In normal Excel UI, you won't find that, right? So what SAP said was, they will provide you the Excel add-in. You need to download that add-in onto your machine, and then via that add-in, you will see this logon option available. You should be able to log in with your credentials here. Okay. So these are the two ways you can log in via web versus log in via Excel. Excel is more popular, where you can configure your planning views and work on those planning views to update your demands, supply shortages, review the inventories, etc. Right? Then SAP has also provided few functionalities which are required from configuration perspective. Right? For that, your configuration expert mostly needs to log into web UI to do this architecture setup. Right? So your configuration team would be more working on web UI as well, from the configuration perspective, from setup perspective. But when it comes to the execution, while reviewing the demand, while reviewing the master data, etc., you may prefer to use your Excel UI. This is how you are going to log into IBP, right, as a separate tool. So there will be a dedicated URL provided. With that URL only, you need to log in. And for that URL, your roles and authorization team will make sure that your user ID is enabled, so that your credentials are accepted by SAP, and you should be able to log in into the web or Excel UI. Right? So far, we will take a pause here. We will stop here. I think today we try to give you a good idea about how supply chain planning works, what are different roles within supply chain planning, what are the functionalities available in earlier SAP provided tools like SAP ECC, APO, what are different modules available, how IBP came into picture, how IBP got evolved, what are the functionalities SAP is trying to focus in IBP, right? Now, next session onwards, it is our opportunity to get into details of each individual submodule, try to understand how a normal use case would be, how I can configure those in system, right? So we will have a detailed demonstration from system perspective. We'll get into system, try to calculate the logics within planning, and then see how the results are effective in that area, right? So I think that's all we would cover. I take a pause here and see if you want to, if you have any questions on the topics what we discussed. Our intention, why we are providing this opportunity for this other consultancies, you would have experience in other ECC modules, but willing to explore new SAP modules which are more getting popular nowadays, right? And although you don't have a expertise in supply chain planning, how you can mature your understanding. This specific training session will help you understand your concepts of supply chain planning, plus how those concepts or the processes can be configured by IBP, what are different opportunities which are available in industry. In addition to my IT knowledge, how I can get into a business user shoes and get into those rules or roles, right? And make comfortable myself in the supply chain domain area, right? How this supply chain is integrated with other modules, what are the configurations that needs to be done, what are the features SAP has provided to integrate the plan with ECC system, right? And probably which additional skills that person should have to configure such kind of integrations. Okay?
Don't forget to subscribe our channel and click on bell icon to update yourself with latest SAP videos.
So I would request you to take a pause, go through this recording, understand that whether it is going to help you, whether the trainer is going to help you mature your understanding from supply chain planning perspective, not conceptually, also in system, right? So that end of the course, you should be able to individually understand, discuss the client requirements from supply chain planning perspective, and have a clear picture that what functionality is possible, what we can configure, how I can configure this, right? So we are trying to make this session very exclusive, interactive session. You will see I would be covering up a lot of topics repetitively until you understand those. I would be giving you opportunities to revise those recordings again and again and come up with questions, right? So if you have any questions on the agenda, etc., please reach out to Parminder or Bhupender, and then his team will get in touch with you. Okay. So looking forward for good participation from next session onwards, and let's make it more interactive and let's make it more useful for us. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for a good explanation.